So one person who would have absolutely hated the Geneva Convention is Daddy Vlad the Impaler, who had quite the reign of terror during his short rule of Wallachia. After becoming Prince of Wallachia for the second time in 1456, Vlad had to deal with the problem of his boyars, who were the nobility of the realm and effectively co-ruled with the prince, so it was in their best interests to choose the weakest prince possible so he didn't intervene with their decisions, which Vlad knew all too well, as only a few years prior his father was assassinated for not supporting them, as well as his half-brother being buried alive. Vlad knew his days would be numbered if he didn't deal with them, so on one Easter feast he had them all surrounded and the older ones and their wives taken away to be impaled, while the younger ones, more able-bodied, were put to work in forcible slavery in horrendous conditions to construct Vlad's imposing castle at Ponari. This episode began Vlad's reputation for cruelty and he soon became known as the Impaler Prince, with German propaganda sources saying this killed 20,000, although the numbers are likely far less. But he did get rid of a third of his boyars this way and raised people of humble origins, giving them land so they'd be loyal to him. But it wasn't just the rich he hated, the poor also were on the receiving end of his reign of terror. The story goes that Vlad invited all the poor, the sick, the weak, the beggars, the gypsies to a grand feast where they ate and drunk like kings. However, it was all a trap. Vlad barred the doors and then set a light to the whole thing, with his justification being that the beggars are the lows of society, worse than robbers as they steal from the hard-working man, and he wanted them eradicated from his lands. Another story of terror comes when Vlad launched a raid into Transylvania to deal with a rival claimant to his throne, where he burnt every village down, impaled every man, woman and child in sight, and when this impaling was happening, as well as their limbs being chopped off, he was dipping his bread in the blood of his enemies, which is perhaps where the origins of the fictional Dracula being a blood drinker come from. And while all this was happening, one of his boyars was so disgusted by the smell, he covered his nose in repulsion, and Vlad saw this of course, prepared an extra long steak for him and impaled him on top of it, saying, "The stench now can't reach you where you are." One of Vlad's most famous episodes of impalement comes when the Ottomans invaded Wallachia in 1462, and although he didn't have the resources to fight them off, he launched a devastating guerrilla campaign against them, where they did finally reach the Wallachian capital of Targovista, where Vlad had left them a lovely gift. 20,000 were left impaled on the road towards the capital, and due to it being a particularly hot summer, many of the bodies were heavily decayed and absolutely stunk, and this soon became known as the Forest of the Impaled. And although the Ottomans did use impalement as well as a form of punishment, likely where Vlad learnt it from as he grew up in the Ottoman courts when he was younger as a hostage, they were still absolutely horrified by this, with some of them noting how babies were fixed to their mothers' chests while the mother was impaled. More of Vlad's tales of terror include nailing Ottoman diplomats' turbans to their heads as he wanted to reinforce their customs of them not removing their religious headdressings, and a nail through the skull was the perfect way to do that. And impaling a peasant's husband-wife after seeing the husband's clothes were in a state of disrepair, and it was the wife's job to keep the husband looking good, so he impaled her and got him a new wife. And it's said while he was imprisoned in Hungary in his later years, where he didn't have access to humans, he was impaling mice and birds just to keep his fetish going. While impalement was his favourite punishment, he did perform every form of mutilation and torture going, with it said that his victims were somewhere in the region of between 40,000 all the way up to 100,000, which are probably slightly exaggerated considering the population of Wallachia at the time was only around 500,000, and although it's slightly exaggerated, it was still impressive how much he killed.